There are pains that do not bleed but consume. Have you ever felt like something is wrong inside you, even when all the tests say everything is fine? You smile, work, and talk. But inside, the body screams and the soul groans. A silent guilt, an old weight, a pain that cannot be explained. What if I told you that there is a psalm forgotten by many, ignored by others, that describes exactly this anguish? A psalm written by a man who discovered the depths of the inner abyss and found healing when he decided to stop hiding. Today, you will discover why Psalm 32 has the power to free not only the body, but the soul sickened by silence. Watch carefully, because whoever listens to the end will realize that God still heals, and often it starts with the truth that hurts but saves. Don't look away. Something profound will happen as this word is revealed. There are pains that exams do not capture. They don't appear on X-rays. They don't translate into medical reports, but they weigh like lead inside the chest. The face even smiles. The body tries to remain firm, but inside, something is silently breaking. This pain has no technical name. She doesn't treat herself with pills, and often no one knows it's there, not even the person carrying it. There are thousands of people who live like this, slowly getting sick without knowing why. They go from doctor to doctor, take different medicines, go on diets, rest, take time off work, but continue to waste away. It's not the liver, it's not the stomach, it's not the heart, but it's not imagination either. The body is warning you that there is something deeper going on, and if ignored for too long, this something poisons everything. It is in this secret place of the soul that an illness that defies diagnosis begins. The silence of guilt, the weight of a burdened conscience, the void that no distraction can fill. Few know, but one of the greatest warriors in the Bible, someone who defeated giants and armies, experienced exactly this, and he was the one who wrote one of the most impactful and neglected psalms in the Bible. A text that does not talk about fevers being cured, nor about blind people seeing, nor about miracles visible to the eyes, but it speaks to an even deeper healing process. What happens when the soul finally stops running from the truth? When confession replaces pride? When peace takes the place of inner despair? That man was David, not the king in his glory, but the wounded man, broken inside, ashamed of his own sins. At a certain point in his life, he became silent. He chose to hide his mistake, suffocate his guilt, and act out with strength. But the price he paid for this was his own body. He himself describes the experience in Psalm 32 with visceral language. While I kept my sins silent, my bones grew old through my constant groaning all day long. These words are not poetry. They are a candid account of a man being corroded from the inside out. It is possible to imagine David waking up unwillingly, walking heavily, trying to lead with an emptiness in his chest. It was in ruins inside. And it wasn't the fear of punishment that consumed him. It was a departure from the truth. Silence before God. The attempt to sustain an appearance that no longer matched the reality of the heart. It is this disconnection that makes you sick when the body tries to live, but the soul is already prostrate. Psalm 32 is a muffled cry that finally finds a voice, and its first half is marked by the confession of a pain that was not physical at the beginning, but that became physical as a result. It's the spirit trying to survive without air. The body is trying to resist without ground. And this echoes alarmingly today. How many undiagnosed illnesses have their roots in untreated blame? How many pains are born from swallowed hurts, sustained lies, and ignored wounds? The body feels everything. He absorbs what the soul rejects. The lack of forgiveness, the repressed shame, and the disguised fear all turn into symptoms, sometimes in the form of chronic anxiety, insomnia, tachycardia, and muscle tension. In others, such as gastritis, unexplained fatigue, and deep depression. In some cases, even as autoimmune diseases. It is not about reducing everything to a spiritual factor, but about recognizing that the human being is one body, mind, and spirit walking together. And when one side gets sick, the others are not left unharmed. David realized this in the most bitter way possible. The silence he chose as a shield became the poison that weakened him. His bones, he says, were aging, not because of time, but because of the pain he refused to expose. This breaks the image of the invincible hero. It reveals a vulnerable, human, real man. And that is exactly where the strength of this psalm lies. He doesn't promise a magical cure. It reveals a transformative process that begins with something simple and brutal: the truth. There is a type of healing that does not depend on a miraculous touch, but on a sincere encounter with inner reality. This is the secret hidden in David's words. It's not a secret because it's hidden, but because few want to see it. Exposing yourself is painful. Admitting ego bankruptcy takes courage. And for this reason, many prefer to live slowly, getting sick rather than face the healing that comes from confronting their own soul. When David wrote this psalm, he was not trying to teach a theological lesson. He was venting, leaving a record of the path he took so as not to be destroyed from within. And the starting point was this: while I was silent, I suffered. This silence was not the absence of words. It was the closing of the heart, the refusal to bear oneself before God. And this refusal was like an invisible fever that consumed him. Psalm 32 begins like this, revealing the pain that grows when the truth is repressed, and the truth, when left unspoken, becomes a prison. There is a prison that no one sees but binds inside, that limits the movements of the soul, that places invisible bars on faith, on spirit, on health. It's when a person lives to look good, but inside they know they are broken. It's like wearing a beautiful cloak over open wounds. Sooner or later, the cloak becomes stained. The pain escapes. The body reveals what the soul tried to hide. This is the reality that many face, even without knowing there is a way out. Psalm 32 begins not with victory, but with weakness. And that's why he has power, because he doesn't talk about an unreachable hero, but about someone who made mistakes, fell, and became sick inside until he decided to stop pretending. There is a type of silence that is not peace. It is the absence of truth, an attempt to maintain control when everything has already slipped through the cracks of consciousness. David did not remain silent because he was calm. He kept quiet because he knew that if he said out loud what he had done, he would have to face the consequences, not just in front of people, but in front of himself. And this silence, sustained by pride and fear, became a daily poison, a slow, invisible, but relentless punishment. Psalm 32 describes a process in which the body accuses what the mouth does not confess. For day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. My strength was turned into drought. It's not difficult to imagine this weight as a constant pressure, an exhaustion that no amount of sleep can resolve. As if an invisible burden were on the shoulders, preventing breathing from being complete, rest from being true, food from being sufficient. Everything becomes dense. Time doesn't seem to pass. Life loses flavor. This is the state of those who live trying to hide from God what he already sees. It's a losing battle. But still, many struggle with it every day, convinced that if they bury their mistakes deep enough, they will disappear. The problem is that what is buried alive does not die. It rots and exhales. It begins to leak through behaviors, reactions, rages, emotional blocks, addictions disguised as relief, and desperate attempts to look good. David knew what this was because he had gone through the most bitter experience of his life. The episode with Bathsheba, a hidden adultery, a plot to cover up guilt, the death of an innocent man. All of this was designed by someone who knew God deeply. It wasn't ignorance. It was a deliberate choice to silence our conscience. And even after all the theater, David found no rest. The child born from that relationship died. The prophet confronted him. But before that, he was already getting sick. God's hand weighed not as a cruel punishment, but as a call to truth, like a father who holds his son's shoulder and stops him from running away. It is in this context that the psalm gains density. It's not just poetic words, it is the diary of a king with an inner collapse. And at the same time, it is the mirror of the soul of so many who carry unnamed pain, untreated guilt, and unresolved stories. The dryness David describes is all too familiar. It's the feeling that something is missing, even when you have everything. It is the experience of living surrounded by resources, but empty inside. The vigor disappears. The desire disappears. Emotions oscillate between guilt and indifference. Nothing seems to satisfy. Nothing makes sense. This type of suffering is more common than you might think. The difference is that few have the courage to admit it. There is constant social pressure to appear strong, resolved, and spiritually stable. And this facade often impedes the healing process. Because where there is no truth, there is no liberation. And where there is no liberation, the soul becomes ill, and the body follows suit. It is important to understand that the 32nd Psalm is not just a personal account of David, but a universal spiritual revelation. He describes an invisible but effective principle. What is not brought to light turns into darkness within us. And darkness does not remain passive. It infiltrates. It shapes our thoughts, distorts our feelings. It harms our relationships. And eventually, it weakens our body. The constant tiredness, the scattered mind, and the sadness for no reason. All of this could be a reflection of something deeper, something that is being avoided. David does not mention direct physical illness, but speaks of vigor transformed into dryness. Talk about aging bones. These are expressions that reveal an affected body, compromised health, and this connection between soul and body is something that science itself belatedly began to recognize. Today, it is known that repressed emotions can generate psychosomatic illnesses, that stress can trigger autoimmune crises, and that deep sadness can compromise the immune system. But this David had already learned centuries before, not on a research table, but on the battlefield of his own soul. The current generation lives a similar paradox. There has never been so much talk about mental health, but we have never been so sick inside. There have never been so many therapeutic resources, but never has there been so much spiritual loneliness. Technology advances, but the soul screams for rescue. And part of this pain comes exactly from this inner silence, this unconscious choice not to confront what needs to be addressed. It's easier to remain distracted than to stop and listen to your own heart. It is more comfortable to keep busy than to look in the mirror of truth. But the truth does not disappear just because it is ignored. It remains there, whispering through tiredness, screaming through headaches, insinuating itself through existential crises, until the body starts to scream what the soul couldn't say. And this scream often comes in the form of a breakdown, a sudden illness, an anxiety attack, an unbearable void, a nameless despair. It was at this point that David arrived. The king who had conquered lands, defeated armies, and led multitudes was collapsing before himself. The hardest fight was not against Goliath, nor against Saul. It was against silence itself, against one's own omission, against the weight of the swallowed truth. And this inner war left visible marks on his body, his soul, and his history. But it also paved the way for something bigger: restoration. Psalm 32 begins with pain, but it is infused with something deeper, an implicit invitation to liberation. David did not write like someone who was drowning, but like someone who had already reached the bottom and was now returning to the surface, still panting, but with his eyes open. He knew that healing began not with a memorized prayer, but with a courageous facing of inner reality. This is the point that many resist reaching, because it requires stopping blaming the world, life, and others. It requires looking inward, not with self-deprecation, but with responsibility. And that hurts. But it is this type of pain that precedes healing. It is the moment when the soul decides to stop getting sick. The moment when silence stops being armor and becomes confession. When the scream trapped in the chest becomes a sincere cry. There is a moment when the weight becomes unbearable. The soul, exhausted from hiding what corrodes it, folds, not out of weakness, but out of resistance. It is at this point that something changes, not by magic, but because space finally opens up for the truth to enter. And when the truth finds a place, it cleans up. It organizes the inner chaos. It illuminates what was hidden. David reached this point. After being silent for so long, he spoke. And when he spoke, he didn't apologize in general. He didn't try to soften his condition. He confessed. In Psalm 32, there is a discreet but profound transition. After describing the suffering that silence generated, he declares, "I confessed my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." These words carry more than relief. They represent a realignment. The soul, once locked within itself, now turns to the only place where restoration is possible. There is no negotiation. There is no justification. Delivery only. This is the sacred secret that few realize. Healing begins with confession. Not a ritualistic confession made out of obligation, but a true confession, born of conscience and courage. Confession is the breaking point with the lie that was fed by silence. It is the key that unlocks the prison of the soul. It's the moment when light enters indoor environments where there were only shadows. Most people associate confession with acknowledging moral errors, but in the context of Psalm 32, it is much more than that. It is a rapprochement with the source of life. When David confesses, he is saying more than "I have sinned." He is saying, "I can't live far from you anymore." It's a return to the center, a decision to break with self-preservation and allow God to touch exactly the point of pain. And in that touch, there is something stronger than judgment. There is forgiveness. Notice what the text reveals. "And you forgave the guilt of my sin." What David experiences is not just the cancellation of spiritual debt, it's relief from guilt. Guilt, that silent companion that slowly corrodes, is uprooted. It's not just about having your mistake erased before God, but about having your soul washed from within. This type of forgiveness generates healing, because guilt, when left untreated, makes you sick. And when it is removed, the body breathes. Sleep returns. The heart calms down. Hope reappears. This is what makes the psalm so counterintuitive. It is not a hymn of victory over an external enemy. It is not a celebration of physical deliverance. It is the story of a man who overcame his own pride, and this victory cured him. The restoration began when he stopped pretending he was okay, when he chose exposure over preservation, when he decided that the pain of keeping silent was greater than the fear of being seen in his truth. This decision is more difficult than it seems. We live in a culture that rewards appearances, that stimulates performance, that requires each one to be strong, resilient, and unshakable. But no one is like that all the time, and the effort to appear strong all the time is, in itself, sickening. David was not just any failure, he was the king, a leader admired, respected, feared. Still, he had to admit, "I was wrong. I walked away. I got sick." And only when he recognized this did he truly begin to stand up. The confession didn't slow him down. On the contrary, she freed him. And that's what many still don't understand. Admitting the truth is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage. It is the first step towards healing that truly transforms. Because what is not confessed remains with power over us, and that which is brought to light loses its strength. David was not trapped by shame. He was led to forgiveness. This process does not happen in an emotional instant. It is a conscious decision, an act of surrender. It's not just about feeling guilty, but about confronting it honestly. To give up protection and allow God to remake from within what no one else can touch. Forgiveness is not an abstract idea. He is a concrete force that restores what sin has disfigured. When David writes that he has been forgiven, he is saying something in me has been realigned. Something that was out of place was replaced. Someone that was sick began to heal. This spiritual healing has repercussions in all dimensions of life. The heart becomes light. Relationships are no longer fueled by guilt. The look shines again. Faith, previously suffocated, begins to grow again. There is a new clarity, a different sensitivity, not because all the problems disappeared, but because the soul began to breathe again. The air circulated inside again. The truth opened space for the Spirit to act. This is what makes this psalm a hidden key. It does not promise immediate healing for the body, but it reveals the origin of many sufferings, and it points the way to restoration from within. What David experienced was a type of healing that doctors do not prescribe, because it is not found in pharmacies. It is a healing that is born from brokenness, that flourishes in the soil of humility, that grows stronger in dependence. This dimension of spiritual healing is often ignored because it requires personal confrontation. There are no formulas. There are no shortcuts. You need to go down, to recognize, open. But whoever does this finds true relief. The lightness that comes from forgiveness is greater than any medicine. And that's what Psalm 32 talks about, of a liberation that begins with the sincere exposure of the soul before God. No masks, no justifications, just with the naked truth and with grace covering what was revealed. Grace does not ignore sin. She confronts him, forgives him, and transforms him. And in this process, something deeply heals. The soul, previously locked within itself, opens up. The body, previously in collapse, rests. The spirit, previously muffled, sings. And this song is not born of euphoria, but of restoration. A new sound, coming from a place that was once devastated, but now flourishes. Because where there is truth and forgiveness, there is life. When forgiveness touches the soul, it does not just end guilt. It reconfigures the heart. It's not like deleting a file and forgetting it existed. It's like taking a broken vase, putting the pieces together firmly, and returning it to its original function, but now with visible marks that tell a new story. Forgiveness does not pretend that nothing happened. He owns what happened, but refuses to let it define destiny. And that is, in itself, a form of healing. David did not emerge from that process as the same man. He did not return to the throne just with the same strength as before, but with an expanded consciousness, with a deeper understanding of human frailty and divine mercy. The 32nd Psalm was not written at the height of his strength, but at the maturity of his soul. And that's why he carries authority, because it was written by someone who not only fell, but also got up with marks that became testimony. The pain that silence generated in David gave way to the lightness of forgiveness. This is not an emotional exchange, but a spiritual transformation. What was oppressed now breathes. What was hidden now finds light, and this light does not destroy him, but frees him. The strength of forgiveness lies precisely in this, in offering the guilty person a real chance of being reborn, not as someone who forgets what they experienced, but as someone who transforms what they experienced into a source of wisdom and grace. Human beings were not created to live with guilt indefinitely. Guilt is not a punishment but an alarm. It signals that there is something out of alignment, something that needs to be addressed. When ignored, it turns into bitterness. When faced truthfully, it turns into regret. And it is this repentance that opens the doors to forgiveness. A forgiveness that is not limited to an external divine gesture, but that becomes an internal balm, healing what seemed incurable. It is common for people to seek physical healing as an end in itself. But David's experience points to something deeper, the healing of the heart as the basis for all restoration. From the moment he confesses and is forgiven, the language of the psalm changes. From pain and groaning, he begins to express confidence and security. The tone of the text changes because the state of the soul has been transformed. What was groaning becomes praise. What was oppression becomes freedom. This change is not just symbolic, she has concrete reflections. A forgiven soul begins to relate to life differently. The look changes, the speech changes, the choices change, the capacity to love expands. Because he who has been forgiven learns to forgive. And forgiveness, when it flows in two directions, receiving and offering, becomes true medicine. David understood this. After experiencing God's mercy, he becomes more sensitive to other people's pain, more aware of your limitations, more willing to live not from strength, but from grace. This turn is essential, because that is where faith stops being just doctrine and becomes a living experience. When the soul touches God's mercy, it no longer remains in the same place. She moves, and this movement generates healing, restoration, and reconciliation. But there is something even more subtle and powerful in this process. Forgiveness received heals not only past pain, but also prevents the perpetuation of pain in the future. Many emotional and physical illnesses arise from the repetition of unresolved patterns. Addictions, abusive relationships, compulsions, and emotional imbalances. Many of these behaviors are unconscious attempts to deal with unhealed wounds. Forgiveness, by breaking the cycle of guilt, prevents pain from turning into destructive behavior. This has immense implications, because it means that Psalm 32 is not just about David. He speaks of anyone willing to abandon the cycle of self-punishment and enter the cycle of grace. This requires more than willpower. It demands humility. The humility of recognizing that you cannot heal alone, that you cannot start again without admitting the point of fall, that you cannot find peace by keeping your defenses up. Therefore, the text has a prophetic weight. He points to a way of living in which confession is not weakness, but strength, where forgiveness is not a prize, but a new beginning, in which the soul, once touched by mercy, becomes lighter, more lucid, more alive. It is this restored soul that also begins to rebuild the body, emotions, and relationships. And this is not theory. It is a spiritual principle that resonates in all areas of life. Many who live sick inside are, in fact, begging for this type of forgiveness, but they can't name what they feel. They look for therapies, distractions, and achievements, but they still have the same emptiness. Because what was done in silence can only be resolved in the light, and what has been denied for so long only dissolves when it is confronted with the truth in a compassionate way. Compassion is the bridge between guilt and healing. God does not forgive harshly. He forgives tenderly. But this tenderness requires surrender. It requires exposure. David did not find healing just because he said the right words, but because he offered his whole heart. He stopped hiding, to control, to manipulate. And in that act of vulnerability, he was remade. Not perfect, not untouchable, but restored enough to continue in peace. This peace is the sweetest fruit of forgiveness. It is not the absence of problems, but the absence of inner war. It is the certainty that the soul is no longer in debt, that you no longer need to pretend, that you can breathe without fear. And with this peace, the body responds. The mind calms down. The spirit flourishes. Life, finally, begins to pulse with truth again. Forgiveness makes room for something even deeper. Refuge. Not just the suspension of guilt, but the discovery of a safe place where the soul can finally rest. David describes this with touching clarity. "You are my hiding place. You preserve me from trouble. You gird me with joyful songs of deliverance." This statement is not born from the euphoria of someone who has just escaped a problem, but from the certainty of someone who met again shelter after walking through long and lonely inland deserts. It is not easy to understand the weight of these words at first glance, but when looking at them in the context in which they were written, they take on another dimension. David, who had previously hidden in physical caves fleeing from Saul, now speaks of a different hiding place, one that is not located in rocks or fortresses, but in the very presence of God. This shelter does not protect the body of the sword, but the soul from collapse. It does not isolate from problems, but preserves identity in the face of crises. And this is a type of cure that many have not yet discovered: inner rest. The refuge described by David is where the soul stops fighting to maintain appearance and allows itself to just be what it is, before the one who knows everything. There, the performance stops. The need for control disappears. Anxiety loses strength, because the soul recognizes that it is no longer alone, that there is a place where pain does not need to be justified, just delivered, a place where flaws are not hidden, but welcomed and transformed. This space of spiritual refuge is where true immunity is built, not in the physical sense of biological defense, but in the broader sense, a stability that resists the instabilities of life. Many believe that immunity lies only in diet, exercise, and medication, and all of these have their value. But the soul also has its immune system, and he is strengthened in the presence of God. It is there that the soul learns to rest, even when everything around is still in turmoil. David knew what it was like to live surrounded by threats, external enemies, political conflicts, family challenges. But in this psalm, he speaks of anguish as something that needs to be faced from the inside out, and he declares that God preserves him from distress. This preservation is not the elimination of problems, but the maintenance of peace in the midst of them. And that peace becomes a shield. Not a shield that isolates, but one that strengthens, that coats the soul with emotional and spiritual resistance. This view breaks the common idea that a cure always means the absence of symptoms or problems. There are situations in which the body remains limited, but the soul is no longer injured. There are people who carry physical scars but live in peace, because health is not just in the flesh, but at the center of the being. When this center is firm, everything else aligns with more balance. The hiding place David speaks of is reconnection with this center. He's not running anymore. He's not pretending anymore. He is hidden, but not as someone who runs away, but as someone who rests. This difference is essential. Running away is motivated by fear. Taking refuge is an act of trust, one step of delivery, a conscious response to the grace received. And this type of rest has therapeutic power, relieves internal pressures, reorganizes thoughts, redefines priorities. Cure. The mention of deliverance songs reinforces this idea. After the silence that sickens, after the cry that breaks resistance, after the forgiveness that heals, comes the song. A new sound, unrehearsed, not decorated, but spontaneous. That springs from relief, of gratitude, from the reunion. The song of deliverance is not a musical refrain, it is a state of the soul, an inner echo that recognizes that something has broken, but also something has been restored. Music has always been present in David's career. He calmed Saul's spirit with harps. He celebrated victories with dances. But now, this song has another origin. It is not the celebration of a military triumph. It is the intimate response of someone who has been reached by a grace that he could not produce alone. And that sound is part of the healing. Because when the soul sings, the body feels it. Emotions respond. Life changes tone. It is important to understand that spiritual hiding is not an escape from reality, but a reconnection with it from another place. The soul, once healed, sees more clearly. The mind, previously dulled by guilt or fear, gains lucidity. The spirit, once tired, finds vigor. And this vigor is not just emotional, it translates into new attitudes, in healthier choices, in more sincere relationships, in a more balanced lifestyle. Psalm 32 at this point is no longer just talking about confession and forgiveness. You are describing the state of a restored soul, a soul that no longer needs masks, who no longer lives in a corner, who found in God a place to rest, and from that rest, a new life is born. This is a type of healing that does not depend on external circumstances. It is born and sustained in the constant presence of those who never abandon it. This awareness changes everything. When you know that there is a safe place, despair gives way to hope. Anxiety loses its grip. Fear is confronted by a security that does not come from logic, but from faith. The soul, previously trapped inside, expands. Find space, silence, understanding. And in this expansion, many pains lose their power, because what became sick no longer finds fertile ground to reproduce. God's hiding place is not a bubble, it's a restorative environment, a fertile soil where the soul can be replanted, where the roots, once dry, return to nourishment, where the shade relieves the heat of pressure, where the breeze of divine presence touches where no one else touches. This is the place where the human spirit is healed to its greatest depth, and this place is available not just for kings, but for everyone who decides to stop running and start resting. All true healing leads to transformation, not just the body, not just the emotions, but the way one sees life, how one interprets pain, how one moves forward based on what has been experienced. Psalm 32 begins with anguish and ends with clarity, not because all the problems were resolved, but because the psalmist was internally repositioned. He now sees with different eyes. The soul, previously wounded, is awakened. The heart, once heavy, is sensitive. And from the midst of this renewal, a wisdom is born that is not learned through theory, but through journeying. David ends this psalm with a type of advice that does not come from the authority of the throne, but from the experience of overcoming pain. I will instruct you and teach you the way you should go. I will guide you with my eyes. This speech has the delicacy of someone who knows the valley, but has also walked towards the light. It's a subtle but firm invitation. Follow this path, because it is real, and it is possible. The road to truth, no matter how painful it may be at the beginning, always ends in freedom. But he also leaves a warning. Do not be like a horse or mule, which has no understanding, whose mouth needs a halter and bridle, so that they cannot come close to you. The figure used here reveals what keeps many from experiencing this healing: resistance. The hardened heart, the mind that refuses to learn, the soul that prefers control to surrender. It is this inner rigidity that blocks the flow of grace. Because grace is not imposed, it is offered, and it only operates fully where there is surrender. The contrast is clear. On the one hand, the soul that opens up, confesses, is forgiven, and finds refuge. On the other, the soul that insists on controlling, hiding, avoiding. One blooms, the other languishes. And it is not just a spiritual theory, but a reality that is perceived in everyday life. People healed internally emanate life, even in the midst of struggles. Those who live protecting themselves from the truth, even surrounded by external victories, carry a weight that no one sees. David, now repositioned, declares, "He who trusts in the Lord, mercy surrounds him." This image is powerful. Mercy as something that involves, protects, and accompanies, not as an occasional prize, but as a constant presence. What you trust, not just what you believe. Trusting implies resting, surrendering, and supporting oneself in something that goes beyond logic. And that kind of trust is only possible when you experience true forgiveness, when you understand that there is no need to hide anything anymore, that mercy has seen everything and still decided to remain. This trust has the power to generate a new kind of life, a light life, even in the midst of responsibilities, a conscious life, even in the face of uncertainty, a life marked not by the fear of falling, but by the gratitude of having been lifted. This is how David ends his song. Rejoice in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous ones. Shout for joy, all you who are upright in heart. This joy is not born of perfection. It is born from restoration. It is the joy of those who have been touched by the truth, crossed the valley of confession, and reached the other side with their souls at peace. The uprightness of heart that he mentions is not the result of a life without mistakes, but of a life without pretense. To be straight in this context is to be sincere. It is living with transparency before God. It's not making up the pain, nor postponing regret. It's keeping yourself vulnerable enough to be treated, shaped, and healed. And this inner posture not only transforms the relationship with God, but also with the world around. Those who experience this type of restoration begin to see others with more compassion, judge less, hug more, listen patiently, corrects gently. Because you understand that pain has no appearance, that guilt can be hidden in even the most spontaneous smile, that there are wars being fought within people who seem to have everything under control, and therefore act with mercy, because you know how necessary it is, because you've already been on the other side. This sensitivity is also a form of healing, because the soul that previously closed in on itself now becomes a bridge. Now share. Now it works. The pain you once isolated now connects. The error that once embarrassed now teaches. The emptiness that once sickened is now filled with purpose. And this is not just a fresh start, it's redemption. That's when everything that seemed lost starts to have a new meaning. The 32nd Psalm is not just a prayer, it's a mirror. It reflects the path of so many who try to move forward without dealing with what was left behind. It shows the hidden illness of the soul that pretends to be well. But it also reveals the real possibility of healing, not by force, not by appearance, but by truth accompanied by grace. This is the sacred secret that few see. Confession is not weakness. It is the portal to freedom. Forgiveness is not an abstraction. It is the medicine that the soul needs. Hiding in God is not escape, it is rest. There are those who spend their entire lives looking for external solutions for internal pain, and you may never realize that what you need most is not outside, but within, inside the heart. In the space where truth meets repentance and grace finds room to operate. This place is intimate, deep and personal, but it is available. Always has been. Just stop, breathe, and choose to no longer hide, but to open. The path shown by David is uncomfortable at first because it demands truth, but it is light in the end because it offers freedom. And this freedom is the greatest form of health, because the free soul carries the body more lightly. A clear mind makes decisions more wisely. The healed spirit infects everything around, and this healing does not depend on perfect circumstances. It is born from an encounter with God, who sees, knows, and yet loves. A God who instructs, guides with his eyes, and involves himself with mercy. None of this is automatic. It's a journey. But the door to this journey is called confession, and the path she follows is made of grace, humility, and truth. That was David's way. It could be anyone's. Because Psalm 32 doesn't just talk about a king. It speaks of a human soul in search of relief. And it shows that the deepest healing begins when you stop running away and decide to trust. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.